Hi, my name's Sarah Kilmer, and I'm the psychologist with Cardiac and Pulmonary Rehab, and I'm going to be talking about coping with feelings. And specifically, it's going to be talking about depression, anxiety, and anger. And these are all feelings that people experience to different degrees at different points in their life. But we do want to pay attention to them because they can affect not only our quality of life, but also our physical health and well-being. So the first one I want to talk about is depression. And, feelings of depression occur to different degrees, and life certainly has its ups and downs, and we often feel sad in response to a loss or an unpleasant event. It's when the feelings become intense, long-lasting, or disruptive that we would be concerned about it. Now, here is a list of some of the signs and symptoms of depression. These are not unique to depression, so there could be other reasons why you have a change in, your energy or your sleep or your appetite. And depression does occur in different degrees. So in order to qualify as having an episode of major depression, a person would need to feel down or sad or have a loss of caring and enjoyment in life, plus some combination of 5 of these, more days than not over a 2-week period of time. But depression can also occur in more mild versions where it's maybe not that intense in terms of the number of symptoms or their intensity or the frequency during the week, but it takes place over a prolonged period of time. Or maybe it's in response to a stressor, but it's more than what we would expect given the situation. But you can look through this list. And certainly if you recognize things in yourself, it would be worthwhile paying attention and trying to figure out a little bit further what's going on. Certainly if you or someone you know is having thoughts about wishing yourself dead or actually making a plan to end your own life, then that's something that you would want to get medical attention for immediately. Now, I want to have a few comments just in general about depression. It is relatively common in the population, and even more so for people dealing with cardiac issues or pulmonary issues. And so we want to pay attention to it because it certainly can interfere with quality of life. It also can affect us physically, and in particular, people with cardiac issues with untreated depression tend not to do as well with their physical health over the long run. Sometimes people have concerns about getting treatment for it, and I think as a country we've come a long way in dealing with stigma related to emotional concerns, but sometimes people still feel like it might be a reflection on their character or a sign of weakness, and it's not quite that simple, really. There are biological, social, and psychological sources to depression, and it is something that is a condition that warrants treatment. If you need to think of it in comparison to something else, if you think about a physical health problem, let's say someone's out there and they're running a race. If they fell down and broke their leg, you wouldn't tell them to just buck up and keep running. No, you'd get them treatment, maybe they'd have some rehab, and then they'd get back into racing. And so I think we can apply that same kind of thinking when it comes to dealing with depression or any kind of emotional distress, that it's something that warrants treatment, and then everybody still has the business of living their life and solving problems and coping, but there's no reason to do it with this unnecessary weight or burden. Treatment can be very effective. Some folks choose to go the route of medication, and this is often something that you can work on with your primary care physician. Sometimes people do go to see a psychiatrist, and there's nothing scary about that. It's just another kind of specialist. Sometimes either instead of or in combination with medication, people will participate in psychotherapy, and that might be weekly or every other week sessions with a therapist or counselor. And psychotherapy can give you a private, neutral place to work through thoughts and feelings and further develop your coping. Now, I've included some self-help strategies here, and they're not meant to be a replacement for treatment, but these are the kinds of things that you could use if your mood has been a little bit off, but that's not your usual state, and it seems to be getting better with time. And so you kind of want to see how things are going and maybe do a little extra to give yourself a boost. Because oftentimes, particularly with cardiac patients, right after the event, when there's a lot of discomfort and uncertainty, there can be a downshift in mood, but then as people begin to feel better, their mood improves, and this certainly can be true for any medical condition. So certainly you could use these strategies if you're going through that process, or let's say you decided to get started on an antidepressant medication from your primary care doctor, but you also want to be doing things in your daily life to boost your mood. And so, certainly it can be helpful to maintain or even try to increase the activities that you're engaging in. And these don't have to be great big things. They can be things like, if you're really struggling, just making sure you get up and get out of pajamas and you make the bed, or all the way to re-engaging with old hobbies or activities. It can be really hard to get started with tasks when you're depressed, but if you can identify things that are small and manageable, if you're able to do them and complete them, that's going to help build your confidence. Staying connected to people can be really very helpful. There's often a tendency to withdraw or isolate when we're depressed, and that can just make the situation that much harder. So certainly if you've got people around you that you can actually see in person, make use of that. Current world conditions make that a little bit harder with the virus, so you may need to make use of video calls or get together with people, but just stay a safe distance apart. Exercise is another thing that can boost mood, and it can also help improve your sleep at night. Another thing that can happen when we're depressed is that people can become overly self-critical and think a lot of negative thoughts about themselves. It's almost like instead of having rose-colored glasses, we're now wearing gray-colored glasses. And while this is part of what goes along with depression, if we leave it unchallenged, then it further fuels our distress. And so if you can become aware of any negative thoughts, then you can try to redirect or soften them. Try to talk to yourself the way you would talk with a friend or a loved one, in terms of your inner thoughts about yourself, and see if that brings you some relief. If you've got that time and the energy, doing something to help somebody else can be another way to boost your mood. Volunteering is something that takes us outside of ourselves, and it's often very meaningful and purposeful. And what volunteering looks like in the world right now is different than what it used to be. So you may not be going out to an organization and spending your time that way, but maybe you can do something where you're making phone calls, or donating supplies, or sending notes to people who might be isolated. So it'll take a little bit more creativity right now, but there are ways that you can extend your kindness to others. And then another thing that can be helpful is to keep a gratitude journal. And this gets back to the idea that there's a tendency to think negatively when we're depressed, and keeping a gratitude journal is a way to try to get back in the habit of looking for the positives. So what you would do is at the end of the day, you'd write down 3 things that you were grateful for. And it doesn't have to be big, grand things. It can be, even as small as it was a pretty sunny day with a blue sky. And again, the idea is that this helps get you back in the habit of looking for positives. Now, anxiety and depression do often occur together, but they are separate things. And we all have periodic worries and concerns, and that's just a part of human existence. It's more when it becomes disruptive, so maybe it's repetitive or it's unproductive, that we would be concerned about it. And there's a whole range of different kinds of anxiety disorders, and it's beyond our purpose to talk about those in detail here. And so these comments are more for anxiety or garden variety worry. Just like with depression, we're concerned about anxiety because it not only affects our quality of life, but it also affects us physically. And part of this too is because when we feel anxious or threatened in some way, it does trigger the stress response and stress hormones, which affects a whole bunch of different body systems. And then, the good news in all this is that treatment is really very effective. So just like with depression, it could be medication, psychotherapy, or some kind of a combination. Now, again, I've included some self-help strategies which are not meant to be a replacement for treatment, but if the feelings are mild, improving, or you're already in some kind of treatment and you want to do extra, you could make use of these. And you'll notice that there is some overlap with what helps for depression. Exercise can reduce stress and tension. Other kinds of strategies that you get exposed to through cardiac and pulmonary rehab can really be useful. Things like progressive muscle relaxation, deep breathing, yoga, and meditation. And at the end, I'll share some resources where you could do some of these practices at home with some guidance and instruction. Limit your use of alcohol and caffeine. A certain amount of caffeine can make us feel alert, but too much makes us feel jittery and on edge. And alcohol, it is a system depressant. And so if you're already dealing with depression or feelings of distress, it can make them that much harder to deal with. A consistent routine, getting enough sleep, that's helpful across the board. And then you may also find it helpful to keep a journal, either as a place to get thoughts off your mind and have an outlet for them, or as a tool for trying to identify patterns or triggers for when your anxiety and tension is on the rise. And then I also wanted to talk about anger and frustration. Anger is just a normal emotion. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a strong feeling of displeasure or annoyance when something seems unjust or something is wrong or goes against what our expectations are. And, it certainly can be useful as an emotion because it motivates us to do things when something is wrong. But like a lot of other things in life, it really matters how often it happens, how strong the feelings are, and how we deal with them. And too much anger or anger that's handled in an unhealthy way can cause a number of different problems. We do have a physical response when we're angry, and so it increases your blood pressure and your heart rate and adrenaline levels. And so, there's a physical effect that we would be concerned about. There's also an emotional toll if you are angry and then have outbursts and then feel guilt or remorse over what you've said. And then it can also damage our personal relationships if we're treating others poorly when we're feeling angry. So it's an important thing to acknowledge and then find ways to manage. And, one starting place is to try to look for triggers. Are there any particular situations that reliably provoke anger in you? And if you are able to identify them, either actual situations or certain emotional states, then you can try to do something to prevent them or, proactively look for different ways to manage them. You can also look for warning signs in yourself that you're starting to get angry. And I know a lot of times people say it happens so fast that they didn't really see it coming. And sometimes it is really quick. But most of the time, if we're able to really observe ourselves and try to slow things down, we can notice the early signs that we're starting to get angry. So there might be certain body sensations, like you might feel physically restless, or you may experience more muscle tension, or you might start to clench your fist or your jaw. You might notice that your temperature changes. So maybe you start to feel real hot or real cold, or maybe you break out into a sweat. There may be certain thoughts that run through your mind. So maybe you start to think, oh, here we go again. And those are the early signs that it's starting to build. And it's helpful to notice those because most feelings are easier to manage when they're small and haven't gotten full blown yet. Now, in the moment when we're feeling really emotional, it's hard to do our best job coping. And so it can be useful to find ways to calm down our emotional temperature so that we can then do more effective problem solving. And you'll notice from this list here that a lot of these strategies are not going to be new to you. So these are those old tried and true strategies like count to 10, walk away, take a breath, take a break from the situation. And the reason why these strategies are useful is because they slow things down and they give us a chance to kind of back off from the emotion and then try to use our more logical problem solving thinking. Now, sometimes it's not possible to physically get distance from the angering situation, and so then you might also try psychological distancing techniques. And what these are things that help us get into a mindset where we feel a little bit removed from the situation. So you can try to think about the situation from a different time perspective. So you can say, how am I going to feel about the situation 3 hours from now? Because oftentimes, given enough time, we can rethink things in a way that's more helpful. Or you can take the situation out of the first person and think about it in the third person. So instead of, how upsetting this is to me, you can think, well, what would I tell my best friend to do in this situation? So you can try to do that. Maybe there's other things that would be helpful. Maybe there's a piece of wisdom from an elderly relative or something from your spiritual faith that when you think about that phrase or that idea, it puts you in a better state of mind. And then there are all kinds of other ones that are out there. If you're a science fiction fan, you can imagine that you're putting up your deflector shields or your force field, and whatever the angering situation is, it's still coming at you, but now it's going to bounce off and it's not going to reach you. Or there's another one that's out there that's called the hook, where you picture yourself as being the fish in the pond and the angering situation is the hook. So here it comes, and you've got a choice. Are you going to bite? Are you going to get that hook stuck in your gut and struggle with it? Or are you just going to swim on by? And I know it sounds a little silly to be thinking about force fields or thinking about yourself being a fish, but that's actually part of why it works, because as soon as you start thinking that way, you're already moving towards taking an emotional step back from the situation. Hopefully you'll experience it as less stressful, and then you'll be able to handle it in a way that's healthier. So, our ultimate goal is to try to work towards healthy expression of anger. Years ago, there was this school of thought that it was okay to just vent, just kind of let loose. And certainly, I think people have the experience that there's a release that comes from that. But the current thinking is that that's actually not the healthiest way to deal with it for a couple of reasons. The first one is that when we're venting and maybe raising our voice or using colorful language, it can be like fuel on the fire, and we can actually end up more outraged or indignant or angry than we would have been if we had thought about it in different terms. And then also, depending on where we're venting or who we're venting at, we may be doing some collateral damage to our relationships that then we have to go back and fix. So venting is not really the preferred method for coping. And then the other extreme of suppressing anger isn't the healthiest option either. So if you're just swallowing it and holding on to it, and that's your main strategy, that may not be good for you. We all have to pick and choose our battles, of course, but if we're consistently holding it in, it may lead to us feeling frustrated or depressed or stressed out, or the feelings may come out, but in an indirect way where we're doing damage to our relationships, but never actually addressing the problem directly. So the ideal would be for us to try to engage in an appropriate expression. And some of the components of that to work towards would be working on your communication skills, clear, non-judgmental, non-blaming language where we're trying to focus on the problem. One quick check you can do as you listen to yourself talking to others is to pay attention to how often you're saying the word you. So, if I'm upset with someone and I'm saying, you're doing this, you're doing that, you're making me so mad, that word you is very blaming, and it often puts people on the defensive. It's kind of like verbal finger pointing. And so if you can phrase things in a more neutral way or in terms of yourself, that can be helpful. Now, there's no guarantees about how the other person will respond, but you're at least doing your part to bring the confrontation level down. So if instead I talk about how I feel bothered or upset, or I would like things to go differently when a certain thing is happening, try to figure out a common goal and then talk about options together, then that may feel more collaborative. And then I guess, I'm looking through the list here. Yeah, so collaborative, not blaming approach. And then certainly trying to engage in problem solving can be helpful. And you may have to press pause on conversations. You may need to agree to disagree and come back to it later. But the idea is, again, to try to reduce the blaming and try to work together. Now, once you're able to get yourself into a little bit of a calmer state of mind, there are also some things that you can do just within yourself to try to help you manage the anger. For example, you can ask yourself, is this situation really worth getting angry about? Again, this is the pick and choose your battles kind of thinking. If you are making a conscious choice to not engage with it, that is different than just suppressing it. Think about the situation, consider alternative ways of making sense of it. So is your anger justified, or is it possible that you've just misunderstood the situation? Even if your anger is justified, will getting angry help? You got to think about what the end goal or outcome is that you're aiming for and what the most effective pathway there is going to be. Like I was talking about before with the venting, watch out for extreme words, dramatic language, because that's like fuel on the fire. And, at the end of the day, a lot of things in life aren't that cut and dry. There's often gray areas. But if we act like it's always that way or never that way, then we may end up more upset. And then the last thing here is to pay attention to your expectations, because a lot of frustration comes from thwarted expectations, either for ourselves or our others. And if you're repeatedly running into anger, irritation, or frustration because your expectations are not getting met, it might be useful to think about whether or not your expectations need some modification. And you may feel like that's not a reasonable kind of thing to do, but again, what's the end goal? If the end goal is to have less stress and less emotional upset, we might need to acknowledge that we can't expect the same things from ourselves, or as much as we want the other people in our lives to be a certain way, that just may not be what's going to happen. And being able to adjust our expectations, we may not be happy about the situation, but we may be less frustrated and angry because we knew what to expect. And then this last slide has some sources for where this information came from, as well as resources. The American Psychological Association has all kinds of information about emotional matters and how to address it. There's the American Institute of Stress, National Institute of Mental Health, and the Mental Health America. The materials by Reed Wilson are about anxiety in particular. He's a psychologist who's an expert on anxiety disorders, and he has a lot of very valuable and useful information on his website. And then the last website, the Greater Good Science Center, they're a group connected with the University of California at Berkeley, and they have a lot of short readings on wellness-enhancing practices, and then if you wanted to do any of them, they have a section with nicely detailed instructions. So if you've got any questions or concerns, please talk with your coordinator about it, and thank you for listening.